I will forego all the various prefatory remarks in the interests of time. And I will say that my interest in the topic here is to deal with populism as an epiphenomenon of deeper processes that help explain or help us understand what populism is all about and how its relationship with democracy operates. My central assumption is that we are currently in a long transitional historical phase, a moment whose outcome is unclear and uncertain, and which is being defined by the confluence of 5 macro processes that I will very briefly touch upon in the interest of time. The salient characteristic of all of these, of the macro level, is uncertainty. And it's an uncertainty that is reminiscent, and in the presence of Mario Monti, it's worth mentioning, it's reminiscent of the famous quotation from Gramsci's prison notebooks, where he in fact spoke about the old refusing to be born and the new refusing to be born and the old being unwilling to die. Then he added, that is the hour of the monsters. And I will come back to the monsters at the end of my remarks. Former President Obama also made similar remarks when he was speaking in Athens a few months ago, when he also said about the fact that we are entering a period of long and indeterminate duration of unknown developments. This particular moment, as I see it, a historical moment, is characterized by the erosion, what I would call existential certainties concerning our societies and their future. In my mind, it is very similar and analogous to the period in the early 19th century, where we witnessed the erosion and gradual disappearance over time of the old agrarian order and the emergence of the new industrial order. It took a lot of time, it involved lots of suffering, and in the context of that, we had the phenomenon of the so-called Luddites, those who tried to destroy the machines which they found to be threatening human labor. I'm not suggesting that the Luddites were in fact populists of the time, but they certainly were a manifestation of that conflict of the old and the new. Now to my 5 converging macro processes. I believe that one very important macro process is climate change. Climate change is affecting vast areas of the planet, exerting huge pressures on human settlements, and causing very significant population movements, leading to an exodus from affected territories. Think only of Northern Africa or Africa, desertification, the push out, and the exodus that is linked to that. Certainly, this is a process that breeds and leads to the erosion of certainties linked to physical security, to the erosion of moral solidarities linked to stable and social arrangements, and therefore causing untold suffering and turmoil. The second macro process is the pervasive armed conflicts that are exacerbating problems arising from climate changing, and also creating worsening living conditions in a number of countries, particularly around the Mediterranean. That also, of course, needless to say, creates existential insecurity, and therefore makes it much more likely that populations will, in fact, look for extraordinary solutions and extraordinary leaders or charismatic leaders, or whatever you may call it. That is another cause eventually of populism. Thirdly, the internet revolution, the technological revolution linked to the internet and the impact it is having on the structures of knowledge, and the erosion of familiar authoritative social institutions that are critical to the organization of society, such as political parties, the production and dissemination of news in an authoritative manner, and so on. Fourthly, again, I'm under pressure for time, the huge socioeconomic inequalities that are the result of the profound disruption of the relationship between politics and the market, on the markets, if you wish, okay, resulting in the ascendancy of economic and financial considerations over societal and political ones, linked ultimately to globalization. These, in turn, obviously, are linked to an erosion of social and political solidarities within the nation state, but also across it, and they certainly have a profoundly negative impact on the quality of democratic institutions. Lastly, with respect to Europe, but more broadly the developed world, there are significant signs of profound demographic decline. Certainly, Europe is an aging society, and the implications of that aging and democratic decline are there to be seen and will have long-term impact on the way we organize our politics and our institutions. One of the byproducts, of course, of declining of fertility and declining demography is the attraction of greater immigration, which then links up to what we've been discussing. The result of all that, ladies and gentlemen, is dislocation, frustration, existential insecurity, anger, all of which feed the phenomenon of populism, as far as I'm concerned. The response, I'm looking at my watch, the response should be, in my estimation, a reassertion of the solidaristic arrangements that have long characterized the Western world, meaning cooperation, meaning international mobilization of forces, particularly between North and South. I'll give you an example. In today's newspapers, we have the news that the German Chancellor traveled to Egypt and then will now travel on to Tunisia in an effort to shore up support for these countries. I won't say regimes, because obviously Mr. Sisi's regime is not what I would call exemplary democracy. But how do you, and she proclaimed the need for a German Marshall Plan, meaning, in other words, how do you provide the sufficient financial resources to these countries to stem the outflow of migration? I remind you of a lesser known example of that, the very successful attempt by Spain to stem the tide of exodus from Morocco and particularly Mauritania in the last decade, where in fact they focused and steered very significant sums of money in these countries and succeeded in stemming the outflows. So for that, I think, is a very good example of what indeed can be done if there is the political will and the cooperation to do that, to reduce flows and to try and promote a positive strategy for coping with the pressures that bring about populism. Certainly on the issue of redressing the balance between politics and the markets, there's enormous room for improvement by regulating the markets in a way that would make it possible for democracy and politics to in fact get the right balance, which has been lost over the past 30 years. I don't have time to go into the great imponderable of all this, which Mario Monti touched upon, which is what will the role of the United States be in this particular conjuncture, and its impact on the evolution of the international system. However, what I will say, because I've got about a minute left, is that the outcome of the challenges associated with populism and the threats that it poses to democracy, I think very much hinges on how these macro processes will play themselves out. And I repeat, we're not in a situation where we know. We're still in the hour of the monsters, not outside. We're not in an area where the new has been born, and we don't know that. This, however, means, and I close with that this is a challenge for democracy, which represents the human agency, it represents politics, and it is for politics to be able to seize the moment and try and regulate the market rather than vice versa. Thank you very much.